You recognize the pattern the moment you hear it. Someone says your money is safe. Your system is neutral. Your transactions are just transactions. And then the rules quietly change behind your back. The uncomfortable truth is this: your life has been routed through invisible choke points, and the people who control them never needed your consent. They just needed your dependence. Today we are going to decode a machine you have been using without knowing it exists. We are going to talk about how a payment network becomes a surveillance network, how surveillance becomes leverage, and how leverage becomes fear. Then we are going to talk about the backlash, a new infrastructure being built for the countries that got tired of begging permission to trade. And before you tune out and call it propaganda, remember this simple psychological fact. When power feels threatened, it does not politely negotiate. It panics, it tightens, it threatens, it pretends it is defending freedom, and it tells everyone else to be grateful for the privilege of staying under control. So yes, this is about money, but it is also about something darker: identity, sovereignty, and the mental conditioning that makes ordinary people accept humiliation as normal. The hidden self is often not afraid of poverty. It is afraid of losing the story it lives inside. It is afraid that what it believed about the world was a lie. Let's start with the weapon everyone pretends is harmless. The system people call SWIFT is usually described like a neutral messaging service. That phrase is doing heavy work. Neutral. Between. Just information. As if sending a message is the same thing as controlling the route, the timing, and the permission slip required to speak. As if the network is a passive hallway, instead of a gate with keys in someone else's pocket. In practice, SWIFT is like the banking nervous system that routes the bloodstream of global trade. And if you control a nervous system, you do not need to swing a sword. You can simply decide which signals get through. You can delay them until the other side loses contracts. You can freeze them when it becomes inconvenient. You can block them when it becomes politically profitable. For decades, Washington has convinced the world to treat the US dollar as the default language of business. The psychology behind that is brilliant and brutal. If everyone speaks one language, then anyone who controls translation controls outcomes. And because so much trade is priced in dollars, even when a company in Asia sells goods to another country, the transaction often touches US-linked intermediaries somewhere in the chain. The moment your money passes through those intermediaries, the American state gets a view, not necessarily a friendly one, a view that can become a choke point. Think about how dependence works in relationships. People do not feel trapped at first. They feel connected. They feel convenience. They feel relief. The partner says, "Trust me, we can handle this. You are safe with me." But the trap is not the first lie. The trap is the moment you stop building alternatives because you have been trained to believe alternatives are impossible. This is what happened to global finance. The world built its daily life around a single dominant channel and then acted surprised when the channel became a weapon. If Russia was the headline example in 2022, the logic is what matters. When a state demonstrates it can cut another state out of the plumbing, it sends a message to everyone watching: this could happen to you, not because you did something wrong, because you annoyed the wrong people. And when you create a weapon too openly, you also create a revolution too quickly. This is one of those uncomfortable truths people avoid. There is a price to using power like that. The price is that other nations learn. They adapt. They stop waiting for permission. So the question becomes, what is the escape route? What is the way to move value without passing through the US's ability to freeze it? This is where the newer infrastructure comes in. The big idea is not just a new app. It is a new architecture for payment and settlement, designed to reduce the relevance of the US-centered choke points. We are talking about platforms that integrate digital assets, distributed ledger technology, and cross-border payment capabilities. In simple terms, it aims to make value transfer more direct, faster, and harder to interrupt through traditional sanctions mechanisms. Now listen closely, because the psychological mechanism here is subtle. The most powerful control does not require constant enforcement. It requires fear of enforcement. If everyone believes sanctions can cut them off instantly, businesses become cautious. Trade becomes smaller. Investment becomes defensive. Even if sanctions are not actively used every day, the mere possibility changes behavior. Sanctions have been used as an ambient threat, like living in a house where someone owns the fuse box. You do not need the lights to go out every night for the threat to work. If the fuse box owner can turn off the electricity when they want, you will start rearranging your life around their mood. So when a new system is built that reduces the effectiveness of that fuse box, it is not just an economic change, it is psychological defiance. It says you cannot scare us into dependence anymore. And the deeper you go, the more you realize why this feels like betrayal to people who benefit from the old order. The US has relied on the idea that others need it. Others need dollar liquidity. Others need access. Others need the American gatekeeper's approval to move money safely. In their minds, trading without that approval is not innovation. It is treason. But here is the uncomfortable truth you are probably already sensing. Many people who complain about geopolitics are actually complaining about losing leverage. They call it politics because they want to hide the mechanism. The mechanism is always the same. Control of infrastructure becomes control of fate. When a payment system allows transactions in seconds instead of days, when it reduces the number of intermediaries, when it enables exchange without needing the dollar as a required bridge currency, the old power structure loses something essential. The dollar's dominance is not just about belief, it is about routing efficiency plus legal permission. If you change routing efficiency and permission logic, you change belief. And once the route changes, the belief collapses faster than anyone expects. Now let's go deeper into the technology, because people use tech words to avoid thinking. They say blockchain, distributed ledger, tokenization, CBDC, and suddenly they feel smart while still not understanding the real threat. The real threat is decentralization, not the marketing kind, the enforcement kind. In a centralized financial system, a small number of entities can intervene. They can say no, they can freeze, they can reverse, they can slow down, they can comply selectively. The power is concentrated. In a distributed system, the data exists across multiple participants. No single actor can simply reach into the system and delete the truth. It becomes harder to apply one-sided control. That does not mean it is perfect. Nothing is perfect. But it changes the relationship between power and action. Sanctions work best when they have a physical choke point. If the choke point is a bank in a certain jurisdiction, if the choke point is a compliance decision, if the choke point is a transfer gate, then pressure can be applied to the gatekeeper. But if value transfer is routed through an infrastructure where there is less reliance on those gatekeepers, the sanctions lose precision. They become blunt instruments, and blunt instruments break the wrong things. When that happens, countries that were already annoyed start using the new route, not because it is better for humanity, but because it is better for their survival. Survival is the key word people refuse to say out loud. Governments are not charities, they are survival machines. When one survival machine believes another has taken its freedom away through financial choke points, it will build counter-infrastructure. So when people talk about the future being post-dollar or multi-currency, what they mean is not some fantasy libertarian utopia. They mean fewer dependencies, fewer hostages, fewer moments of panic where a transaction suddenly becomes impossible because a government decided it. This is why the movement matters for ordinary people too, because when states shift settlement rails, the impact travels downward. It affects energy prices, trade costs, supply chains, inflation dynamics, and eventually wages and household expenses. The hidden self in this story is not a banker. It is the average person who thinks global finance is remote and then gets hit anyway. You feel it as rising prices, job instability, currency pressure, and confusion. You feel it as a sense that the world is rigged and no one admits how. You call it bad luck, you call it a cycle, you call it politics, but it is infrastructure. And infrastructure changes behavior. Now, there is another layer that most people miss because they get stuck on messaging. The new infrastructure is not only about payments, it is about backing and trust. Trust is a commodity, and the US dollar has been backed by something more psychological than physical for a long time. The dollar is not just a token, it is a story that the world keeps buying. The story says the system is stable, the enforcement is predictable, the rules are fair, and the US will manage outcomes without chaos. For decades, that story worked because the US could enforce it and because competitors were weaker. If you control the enforcement mechanism, you control the story. If you can punish the deviation, you deter the alternatives. That is how narratives become real-world constraints. But trust decays when the story keeps contradicting reality. When a country repeatedly weaponizes finance, when it freezes assets for political reasons, when it changes the interpretation of rules, what you create is not only economic risk, you create moral suspicion. You create a mental habit in other actors. Never be too exposed, never be too dependent, never put everything in one basket that someone else can kick. So the response is not only to build rails, it is to create backing that cannot be easily undermined by one jurisdiction's decisions. This is where the talk about digital gold and commodity-backed reserves becomes relevant, not as a cute investment idea, as a strategic trust mechanism. A signal to the world. If you want to trade with us, you can trade with value that has an anchor outside our rival's printing press. Let's destroy the myth that this is just speculation. Gold and strategic commodities are the opposite of speculation. They represent scarcity and physical constraints. They do not depend on a political decision to print more units. They depend on extraction, supply, and demand in real markets. When you combine that with digital settlement, you get a system that behaves like a bridge between physical scarcity and modern speed. You can move it digitally, but you cannot magically expand it like fiat money. That difference is psychological poison to a debt-based empire. Why? Because fiat dominance depends on the ability to expand supply without immediate punishment. If the world believes in unlimited liquidity from one source, then the source can sustain deficits while outsourcing the inflation costs to others. It is not that the US is the only one printing, it is that the US benefits from being the default settlement currency. When other actors reduce their need to hold enormous amounts of US debt, when they shift reserves away, when they diversify the settlement layer and the backing logic, the debt machine starts to choke. And now we reach the part that people find too uncomfortable. The debt problem is not a moral issue, it is a mechanical one. A government with huge debt can sometimes keep borrowing indefinitely because global demand treats its bonds as safe assets. The safety is partly economic, partly institutional, partly the result of geopolitical dominance. Global institutions and central banks buy the debt because it is convenient and because there is an assumption of stability and liquidity. But if the world starts asking a different question, the demand changes. The question becomes, why hold this asset if it can be targeted, diluted, or undermined during conflict? Why hold this liability if alternatives offer similar liquidity with less political risk? Once demand shifts, the bond market reacts. Yields rise, financing costs climb, inflation risks reappear, political incentives tighten. That is how a financial empire stops being an engine and starts being a burden. The hidden self here is the denial inside the empire too. Many people inside the dominant country want to believe the old story can be maintained through threats. They think they can punish the competitors into staying in their lane, but that is a childish belief. Power does not work like that forever. Eventually, the oppressed adapt. This is why the response you see is not only building alternatives, it is also increasing pressure. You threaten taxes, you threaten retaliation, you threaten allies. You pretend the punishment is about economics rather than sovereignty. But threats are also a signal. Threats tell everyone watching that the old system is losing control. If it were solid, you would not need to scream. This is the part where the narrative becomes brutally personal, because you, the viewer, have experienced the same dynamic in your own life. Someone says, "Trust me." Someone says it is for your own good. Someone says you have no choice. Then they threaten you if you try to leave, not because you are dangerous, but because their control is being tested. You learned that leaving is harder than staying because the cost of leaving feels bigger. You learned it emotionally long before you learned it economically. Many people stay stuck in relationships, jobs, or communities because they cannot imagine a clean exit. The hidden self tells you you are incapable of surviving without the system that hurt you. But when governments build escape routes, they are doing what people in pain rarely do. They stop asking permission. They start building capacity. So when a new system is quietly integrated by major resource regions, you should understand what kind of person is making that decision. They are not making it because they like complexity. They are making it because they are calculating risk. Resource exporters have a brutal incentive. They want stable demand and stable payment. They do not want to gamble that the buyer's government will change its mind mid-contract because geopolitics shifted. They do not want to be hostage to someone else's sanctions regime. So if they find a way to settle trade using fewer political choke points, they will take it. They will do it quietly at first. Because early adoption is always risky, but once it works even once at scale, the next contract becomes easier, then scale becomes momentum, then momentum becomes a new normal. And that is how revolutions happen in systems that pretend to be boring. Now, what about the US response? People love to watch the headlines because headlines feel like the real world. But this story is about something else. Which side controls the infrastructure when the pressure test arrives? The political response often tries to restore dominance through coercion. If you can't stop the innovation, you try to slow adoption. If you can't stop adoption, you try to punish participants. If you can't punish them, you try to create competing alternatives like a digital dollar or policies that keep activity inside US-controlled rails. But there is a difference between a centralized asset and a distributed architecture. A digital dollar can still be controlled, it can still be permissioned, it can still be restricted, and most importantly, it can still be frozen. If a system is built for power, power will use it. If it is built for neutrality, neutrality becomes the selling point. If you claim you want freedom while building a lever to force compliance, people will not be fooled forever. That is the uncomfortable lesson for anyone inside powerful institutions. You cannot demand trust and also keep acting like you own the fuse box. Now, let's talk about what happens when all this becomes operational. Because the scary part is not only that the dollar loses prestige, the scary part is that the behavior of institutions changes. If major central banks and trading partners start diversifying settlement away from the US-centered system, their US dollar liquidity and their exposure to US debt may decrease, not necessarily overnight, not necessarily with declarations, but gradually, quietly, contract by contract. Gradual changes are the most dangerous because they avoid panic until the moment panic becomes rational. Markets do not reprice risk until it becomes visible. In the early stage, everything looks fine. People feel safe. Then a threshold is crossed. Suddenly, the bond market anticipates less demand. Suddenly, yields rise. Suddenly, borrowing becomes expensive. Suddenly, the political system faces a feedback loop. This is where the hidden self of the empire appears. Many leaders fear admitting weakness, so they do something else. They try to distract.